2. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our first of our 3 Fair Housing Series events for the month. Today I'm really excited to introduce Bill Dedman. He's going to tell us a little bit about the investigation, and I'll get into that in just a second. But before we do that, I wanted to, while I have your captivated attention here, remind everybody that we are doing a fundraiser for West New York Heroes this year. And right now the fundraiser is this little cute buffalo ornament. So for everyone who can see that, I don't know if you can see that there, that's better. They are $10. You can get them either by calling Beanar. Chris will take care of you there. You can pay for them cash or check, or you can also pay for them via Venmo, and you can reach out to me for that, okay? All right. Well, with that being said, let's move on to all of our great information that we have today. Bill Dedman joins us. He's one of the leading reporters on, or no, he is the leading reporter on the Newsday undercover investigation of racial steering by real estate agents. He designed the hidden camera project called the Long Island Divided, which showed agents reinforcing racial segregation through illegal steering of home buyers. The project has launched investigations by state and federal authorities and several steps by the National Association of Realtors to increase awareness of fair housing issues. Newsday's team received several national awards for their work, including a Peabody Award. Bill is a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter and #1 best-selling author of the biography Empty Mansions, which he received the 1989 Pulitzer Prize in investigation reporting for his work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on the Color of Money, his series on racial discrimination by home lenders in middle-income Black neighborhoods. He has spoken on fair housing and fair lending issues for the National Association of Realtors, the Federal Reserve, and many financial associations. Bill is going to address for us how the tests of real estate agents were conducted, the major findings, and what can agents do to ensure their fair treatment of consumers. We are going to be answering questions today, so please everyone use the chat for questions. Joel Huskvar, my president-elect, will be monitoring the questions and we will have time to respond to them a bit later. Bill, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Amber. Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share with you our Newsday team's work on fair housing. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been surprising and gratifying that so many real estate associations around the country have responded to our newspaper team's investigation and are using it to provoke an important conversation. So I'm hoping that together we can dive into looking at some snippets of our Newsday video of agents in action, perhaps not on their best days. And I'm hoping that together we can talk about what agents can say about schools, about new training that's available. So my goal is that this session will be helpful to you, but also challenging, something for you to think about and to take action on.
Great. You won the Pulitzer Prize for an investigation into mortgage lending practices. I thought it might be interesting for our viewers to hear a brief summary of that investigation. And how does that investigation compare to this one?
The stories in the Atlanta newspapers were called The Color of Money. They were about redlining, the practice of mortgage lenders doing business on one part of the map, but not another. Now, this was back in the late 1980s. Redlining had gotten a lot of attention earlier, but seemed to be thought of as something from the distant past. We found lenders in Atlanta and elsewhere making loans in white areas, even lower income white areas, but not in Black areas, even the higher income areas that were home to Coretta Scott King and Andrew Young and the vice presidents from Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines. Now, a couple of things are interesting about that and connect to this recent investigation. First, the customer would have no way to know where the banks didn't make loans. So the customer would have no basis for making a complaint. And also, it was interesting how the banks were operating. We found differences in branch locations, in which real estate agents the banks were marketing to, even where customers could put in a loan application. One of the lessons was that small actions, perhaps unintentional ones, could have a huge impact in perpetuating a segregated system. And I'd like to mention a later project for the Boston Globe, which looked at traffic stops in Massachusetts. Our series was called Speed Trap. An interesting thing about being stopped by an officer for speeding is, first, that we were all speeding. And second, you, again, have no way to know if you're being treated equally. If you get a warning, did everyone else get a warning? If you get a ticket, does everyone else get a ticket for that speed? It's similar to being a real estate customer. You have no way to know what listings are given to someone else. You would have no reason to complain. What we found was that in Massachusetts, who gets a ticket and who gets a warning is easy to predict if you know the race, sex, and age of the driver. For example, women much more often got a warning instead of a ticket, especially younger women up to about age 40. It's the same as who gets roles in Hollywood. Minorities almost always got the ticket, especially Black and Latino men. So there seemed to be some racial profiling at work in that decision being made at the window. Now, again, the customers wouldn't know, and maybe even the officers wouldn't know how it breaks down. But as with home mortgages, the public records answered questions about what was happening, and then we had to dig in to see why it might be happening. I think what's different about Long Island Divided is that we're not coming along later looking at records. With the video cameras, you can watch people violate the law. And also, I think it matters that you can see specific agents and their names of their companies on the screen. You know, having that caught on video, I think may lead to a greater impact in changing the system.
In the Newsday investigation, it's become the most prominent example of existence of race-based bias in real estate. Why did Newsday start the investigation in the beginning?
So many of you are familiar with Long Island. We're talking about an area with 2 counties stretching east of New York City with almost 3 million people. It's a heavily segregated suburb, perhaps the most heavily segregated in the nation. What we mean by that is there's a lot of diversity overall, people from all races and nationalities, but living mostly separately. Especially African Americans are concentrated in very few communities. Out of more than 200 communities on Long Island, a majority of the Black residents live in only 8 communities. And also, we had long heard anecdotes, stories from Black home buyers who had encountered problems when they tried to buy a home in white or somewhat integrated areas. We'd heard that even from our own colleagues at the newspaper. So what we decided to do was to follow the methods used by fair housing agencies and sometimes state regulators in doing testing, with the addition of hidden cameras for video and audio. And that's legal in New York. It's legal in most states. Most states require only one party to a conversation, and that can be the home buyer or the tester, to consent to audio recording. There are about a dozen states where hidden audio recording is not allowed, but you can still have testing there. Testers can be debriefed. We can look at the listings that they're given. Now, I'd like to show you an introductory part, a brief clip from our documentary film. The project is called Long Island Divided. It's all online at newsday.com/divided. The film version, the 40-minute film, we called Testing the Divide. What happened in this video clip surprised us. It wasn't really what we were testing for, but we kept seeing it time and again. One customer would receive service from an agent, while another customer in the same circumstance would be refused service.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional, how can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different areas?
I'm not going to send you anything you want to unless you don't want to store it in your car to buy your friend.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way.
Yeah, okay, I definitely need that.
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, you shouldn't tell the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination. You would never know unless you go undercover.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester, and they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor. They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I guess. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, about getting pre-approved.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out anyone unless you have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to. So that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
Bill, please give us a summary of the tests and who was tested and what was the outcome?
Our Newsday team focused on home sales, sending out first-time home buyers. We'd send a white home buyer and then an Asian home buyer, or a white and black or white and Hispanic shopping for their family. And we'd mix up the order of who went first. The home buyers gave the agent the same circumstances. They were first-time home buyers, so selling another property was not involved. We chose testers of the same gender and roughly the same age. We dressed them in the same business casual style. We bought shirts for the men. I went shopping at Nordstrom for similar purses for the women. They asked for the same number of bedrooms and the same area. They were prepared to give the same income and the same credit scores, but rarely were asked for any financial information other than mortgage pre-approval status, as you saw, on which they were identical. We shop for houses from entry level. Now in New York City area prices, entry level is about $400,000 to the high end, $7 million. Now, $7 million won't get you Alec Baldwin's house in the Hamptons, but it'll get you into his neighborhood. Always the same price range though for both people in a test. And they saw the same agent. Now that wouldn't really be necessary for a fair housing lawsuit or investigation. I mean, under the law, 2 different agents at the same brokerage are also supposed to treat customers equally. But we thought it would be more fair and more persuasive to have the same agent see both customers. How did we pick the agents? We didn't. The brokerages picked which agents would be tested, though they didn't know it. Whoever was on the board to handle walk-ins or phone calls or internet contacts, that was the agent who was tested. We did 86 of these pairs, 86 tests at 12 companies, 12 brands that together represent more than half of the sellers in our market on Long Island. Familiar names: Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, Remax, as well as the large regional brands, Douglas Elliman, Corcoran, etc. Our team then reviewed more than 200 hours of videos to see how the customers were treated and analyzed thousands of listings to see what school districts and communities they had been given. We did not feel comfortable being the referees, so we had two fair housing experts review each test for equal treatment. One had run a testing program for the Department of Justice, and the other is the law professor who wrote the textbook on fair housing law. And only if both of our referees independently threw a flag did we call a penalty on an agent. But we didn't publish yet. Before we published, we gave the agents and their brokers details so they could come in and watch the videos if they wanted and respond to our findings before they were published. So this was a careful effort that took more than 3 years. This was not a drive-by investigation. Now, the results. The agents gave unequal treatment in 40% of our tests, 4 out of 10. But the results varied in interesting ways. Asian buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 19% of the time, 2 out of 10. Hispanic buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 39% of the time, 4 out of 10. And Black buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 49% of the time, 5 out of 10. Now, most of the attention has been on that high difference for Black customers, and that seems right. But don't lose sight of the rest. If 4 out of 10 Hispanic buyers or 2 out of 10 Asian buyers are treated poorly half a century after the civil rights laws were passed, those seem like high numbers as well. We viewed this as testing the gatekeepers in real estate to see how they were performing. There were 2 of the 12 companies that passed all of their tests. They were smaller regional companies. It's fair to say that most of these major national and regional real estate companies were contributing, not creating necessarily, but contributing to the racial segregation in our suburbs. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, would the results be any different if we repeated the test in Buffalo or anywhere else? If 3 retired police officers this weekend go shopping, they're from New York City, and they come shopping for houses in your community, 1 white, 1 Black, one Asian, throw in a 4th who's Latino, would they go home with the same listings coming to their email? Now, what sort of differences did we see? First, we saw steering. Agents directed 1 out of 4 of our minority home buyers into different communities and different school districts altogether than their white counterparts. Also, differences in how they were pre-approved or screened. A minority buyer would be asked for ID, but the white buyer would not. Some agents would not help our Black or Hispanic buyer unless they signed an exclusive contract with that brokerage, but didn't require a contract of the white buyer. And then there were inappropriate comments by agents. You know, minority buyers were not subjected to racial comments or inappropriate remarks, and we're long past the days of signs that say whites only. But the white buyers heard inappropriate comments about race. Here's a video clip that highlights the problem of inappropriate comments.
Hispanic community came in, and they really took over Springs and Northwest Woods area.
Here, an agent gives conflicting advice about Freeport.
I like Freeport. Now you have a bad school district, and that's not good for resale value.
All the school bus, see the moms that are hanging out on the corners.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood. It's mini United Nations.
Because you might be more comfortable in a certain demographic area that isn't heavily one way or another in terms of the people.
Bayshore has two school districts, Brentwood and Bayshore. You don't want to have Brentwood school districts. You want to have Bayshore school district.
I can't say anything, but I encourage you, I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your wife, buy diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They didn't buy there.
No, that's great.
I have to say it without saying it, you have the knowledge of the areas,
Yes.
I don't want to use the word steer, but I try to, I'll use another word, I educated the areas,
Yeah. How are you, Russ? Hey, Russ. Good. How are you?
We're either waiting for the owner or waiting for the agent to show up.
You don't want to be. I don't think you should be in Elmont. I think you should probably just be Franklin Square.
And I remember specifically, he talked about steering.
Yes, that's what he said. Steering, yeah.
Yeah. And in the same breath, he mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
There's something called steering. No steering, like steering.
Oh, like a car or something?
No, like a horse, even.
It seems that some agents may have gotten a message that complying with the fair housing laws is some sort of political correctness, that it means not saying the wrong thing or not saying the wrong thing to the wrong person who might complain about it. It may be that we need more attention to steering, to differential treatment on what agents do and not just what they say. And are we giving the same advice to all clients? Are we treating all clients equally?
We've been talking a lot about steering. What forms did this unequal treatment take?
Oh, steering is an imprecise term. I use it too loosely myself. It's often used as a catch-all for various behaviors. So, for example, we saw an agent telling one person there is no housing in your price range in that area, but then showing housing in that price range to others. That's steering. We also saw agents make unsolicited comments about the race or ethnicity or religion of people who live in an area, or comments about the schools or crime or resale values as a way of encouraging or discouraging someone from living there, while giving contrary information or being silent on those matters to the other customer. You saw an example of an agent telling the white buyer to avoid an area because of poor resale values while encouraging the minority buyer to look there. We also saw differences in the level of service. Overall, our white testers got 50%, 50% more listings than their black counterparts. Now, we've been discussing this in terms of individual buyers, but look at it for a moment, neighborhood by neighborhood. Both testers would ask for an area, let's say within half an hour of downtown or within 20 minutes of this community. And of course, that area, that circle would include many communities or neighborhoods of different demographics. But sometimes in the wider areas, the wider residential areas within that circle, homes that were for sale would be given only to our white buyer. So minorities were in effect steered around those communities. That's what we were testing for, but something else also happened that we hadn't expected. We had minority communities. Homes were for sale. They're within the circle for both buyers, but neither buyer of either race got those listings. So these are the communities with more than a modest amount of Black population. Agents were steering around those for everyone. Our experts scratched their head for a moment and said, now who has the lawsuit in that case? Well, they figured it out. Not only are the white and minority buyers being steered illegally, they have a case under the Fair Housing Act, but the communities themselves are being harmed, the governments, and anyone who has tried to sell a home in those areas, and their listing brokers have a lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act against the brokerages that are steering around their communities. Fewer buyers means lower home values, lower home equity, and less tax money for schools. Here's a video clip with a classic example of steering. An agent tells one family that an agent would be a good place to live with good people, the nicest neighbors, while the agent warns another family that it's a gang-infested, dangerous place to live.
Kelvin Toon is a black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're the nicest people.
When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going to visit.
Do you want to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white testers saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the black tester. The listings centered black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood and was directed towards much whiter neighborhoods.
Bill, do you think the agents included in this documentary were knowingly steering, or do you think some of it was an unconscious bias?
Amber, this is a tough question. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't matter. The Fair Housing Act and your state and local laws cover behavior, not thoughts or motives. The law is not a mind reader. If an agent is treating one person better than another similarly situated person, and the difference between them is one of the 7 categories in the Fair Housing Act, the agent has violated the law. To remind you, those categories are color, race, religion, national origin, disability, sex, and family status, which we usually take to mean having children or being pregnant. And you also have state and may have local laws that could include marital status or sexual orientation or other categories. Now, though it doesn't matter legally, it is interesting to speculate about the motivations of the agents. If you want to stop something from happening, you have to consider why it's happening. Some agents may, in effect, be profiling, that is, assuming that the person of color can't really afford homes in that price range or can't qualify for the mortgage and will be wasting their time, while accepting the same price range without question from a white buyer. One of the tricky things about profiling is that it's so ineffective. You know, we usually talk about profiling as though it's a shortcut to success, but you break a few eggs. It's some sort of politically incorrect thing. But experts say the real problem with profiling is that it doesn't work. Let's say you want to stop school shootings from happening. Who plays video games or dresses a certain way is not a good predictor of who will be a school shooter. So the profile fits too many good kids. You waste investigative resources. And it may miss the kid who's planning an attack. What's a better predictor? Acquiring weapons, telling other students to watch out on the school cafeteria on Thursday. Or think about airport safety. Religion is not a good way to identify who is a terrorist. And in real estate, race is not a good way to identify which customers can afford a home. You leave too much money on the table if you assume that people of color can't be good customers. So besides that, it's illegal. Now, some agents may think, consciously or not, that they'll make money faster with less effort if they show people homes where you'll feel comfortable. You heard an agent say something similar to that. But why assume that people want segregated neighborhoods? Besides, it's illegal. Some agents may not have a bias themselves, but may be bowing to bias that they expect from others. Maybe agents fear that sellers would be angry if they brought a minority buyer into their home or a white neighborhood, or the neighbors who are potential customers in the future might not like it. Or agents could think that appraisers or lenders would be biased. And there's recent evidence of problems in appraisal. It would make it harder to close a sale. Again, none of that matters because steering is illegal. It's possible that a few agents may be prejudiced. I just assume that that's a very tiny group, so small as to be irrelevant to our discussion. There's too much steering for it to be accounted for by the actions of bad agents. Good agents have to be doing it too. You know, in general, on issues of race, it's easy to apply all the heat to an issue of who's the racist, who in our office might be a bigot. It's not very productive. It's more productive to apply light to the question, how does it work in our office? Is what we're doing treating people equally or differently? I think it's interesting also to consider the point of view of the home buyer, even if in our case they were actors, testing the agents. Our testers often came back from the real estate office telling us that agent was so nice. They only learned the truth when our team brought the buyers together to show them the maps of the listings and to let them watch the videos. You'll meet some of the testers in this video clip and also hear from a fair housing expert who works with them.
It almost makes me wish that the racism is more explicit so that I would know about it.
Too often I hear people who maybe aren't as familiar with this kind of work say, oh, well, they were just testers. But all you have to do is tell someone, which I have to do on a fairly regular basis, that you were turned down because of your race, and tell them the circumstances that occurred on a particular test. And you will see just how real and painful that injury is.
Elmont, you know, it's okay, it's good, you're very close to the city. Some of them are not as nice, you know, Elmont.
I do remember him, he was nice, and I do remember him pointing out on the map.
Oh, he loved that map. I remember that.
Yeah, he had the map, and he's like, you know.
Some of these towns, in my opinion, are not necessarily the greatest in terms of school districts, safety, you know, crime, resale.
One of the problems, or I guess patterns, that startled us was that the agents time and again would begin their presentations to the buyers. Remember, these were new customers with inappropriate comments or with information that violates the Fair Housing Act. This agent with the map, a second generation realtor, he looked like General Patton planning the invasion of Sicily, but he had a different plan for home buyers of different races. For the whites, it was don't get off the highway until you get past these neighborhoods. Note that it didn't seem to be offhand, casual comments. Nobody was blurting something out when they got cut off in traffic on a home tour. It seemed to be the sales pitch, the standard guidance for narrowing the home search. I hate to say it, but for these agents, it seemed that steering was the service that they were selling.
What role did schools play in the actions of the agents?
Oh, time and again, we heard agents explain to our buyers, everything is by schools. Agents touted one district over another. Some districts were blue ribbon and others were declining. Buyers would come back to our office from the same agent with lists of school districts, and the lists would be different. Notice that American school districts are so segregated by race in many communities that directing someone to a certain school is the same as directing them to an area with a higher or lower minority population, whether you mention race or not. America's schools are more segregated now than they were 30 years ago. So school segregation and housing segregation are intertwined. Now, around the country, some agents have picked up the idea that they can't talk about schools at all. You've heard agents say, oh, I can't mention schools. The Fair Housing Act doesn't say that. Agents can give straightforward, factual information or answer questions or refer customers to websites or booklets or flyers with information. The problem arises when agents are picking and choosing different districts for different customers, or making comments about the demographics in schools, steering customers away from certain districts, especially if they're silent on that matter or give contrary information to another customer. Here's a discussion of schools from our video, and you'll hear from our law professor, an advisor on our project.
I said, do you really want your future children going to Amityville School District?
We're going to try and stay away from Freeport, Roosevelt, Hempstead for now because of the school district.
This part, the Salisbury part, is in demand because the schools are much, much, much better.
In Newsday's 86-pair tests, agents often applied a laser-like focus on school districts, highlighting their perceived quality when recommending places that house hunters should consider buying or avoid. Fair housing experts say touting or disparaging school districts can put agents in jeopardy because talking about school districts can be taken as a euphemism for race.
There's a few districts that I know I would I won't look in those towns.
Oh, okay.
You know, like Freeport and Baldwin and Amityville, which is part of Massapequa schools, but it's just certain parts of Massapequa.
If the customer asked about the quality of the schools and the agent responded with accurate information, I think the agent would be fine. The problem with talking about differentials in schools is that at least in the last 10 or 15 years, that has been a proxy for race. They don't mention the race of the community. Good schools are available in these areas. Those areas I'd stay away from because they have poor schools. I want to ask, did you tell that to the other tester? If you're only giving that information to one tester of the two, and the only difference is the race, then you've provided what I call differential service.
If you're in Massapequa, you only want school district 23. Okay. You don't want 6 in Massapequa because that takes in Amityville, and you're not going to like those schools.
Schools are the hardest part of this, so let's think through this together. How do you discuss school quality, which you know customers will ask you about, without violating the fair housing laws? First, notice that you don't have to talk about race to be steering. We all understand that if the districts vary in race and you're promoting one over another, you're steering. But what should agents do? Some companies do suggest that agents not talk about schools. Others suggest that they limit their information to answering factual questions. You can say where your kids went to school. You can say if they had a good experience there. But stay away from the trap of using vague labels or responding to those labels from the customer, such as good or nice or high performing. Here's the complicated part. If it's okay to share websites with objective information, is it okay to talk about school test scores? Write this on the blackboard 100 times. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. School test scores tell you mostly how wealthy and educated are the parents who send their kids to that school. Wealth and education of parents is a very good predictor of their children's test scores. And race in America is a good predictor of wealth and education. So you see the problem. A high-performing school may just be a wealthier area. And a school with lower test scores might actually be the higher performing one, where good teachers are bringing up the scores of students who are growing up with fewer advantages. Just recently, greatschools.org, the school ranking website that so many realtors refer customers to, has realized this pitfall. It's changed its ratings, especially in states where all it had to base the ratings on was test scores. It realized that that was just perpetuating segregation. The National Association of Realtors has spoken up in favor of this change. So, can you talk about school test scores and refer parents to websites listing them? Yes, legally you can. But is it right to do this in a country as segregated as ours? That's a moral question, not a legal question. NAR is actively working on giving you better guidance about schools, starting with a film that will come out later this year. I suspect that schools will be the area over the next decade where how we approach this will change the most.
What was the reaction from the real estate industry and from government?
Amber, it seems fair to say that we raised awareness of these issues. Often I'm asked what happened to your fellow New York real estate agents in the videos. We know that disciplinary hearings for the agents are continuing and will probably continue through most of this pandemic year. We're aware that one agent in our tests gave up her license voluntarily when the state investigation began. So we'll see if anyone loses a license or gets fined. The agents and the brokers were already called to testify in public before a New York Senate committee hearing. They were sworn in and asked questions. You can watch it online. Some handled it well, saying they hadn't understood that what they were doing violated the law, but they realized that it was inappropriate. Others got a public thrashing from the senators. The agent who said, follow the school bus, see what mothers are waiting to meet the bus. She said she just meant for the customers to know where the bus routes were. And the agent who said the Hispanics are taking over this neighborhood, he said he meant that in a positive way. One New York senator told him, on behalf of everyone with a brain, I'd like to tell you how ridiculous you sound. The most surprising part of the hearing was that the brokers all said that they had reviewed the tests and the video and found nothing wrong. Nobody did anything wrong. Their position seemed to be that if steering isn't announced, if you don't say out loud, I am now going to make a decision based on race and violate the law, then it wasn't illegal. But you know better, and the senators know better. After the hearing, the New York State Senate unanimously approved changes to state laws. Action in the state assembly we're waiting on. It seems likely that it's going to pass. Let me show you a picture of some of those changes. Now you see a member of the Senate there said, essentially what we've done is we've taken the Newsday investigation and we've turned it into state law. Now we'll go through some of the changes, and these are in the Senate bill that passed unanimously. The first thing is testing of real estate agents, more testing under the state attorney general's office. Adding fees to a broker's license and a salesperson's license to pay for that testing. Requiring standard procedures for bringing in new clients for a questionnaire, a checklist, what you ask of everybody. Then from the state, additional training, fair housing training was already required, but additional training on implicit bias, the history of segregation and fair housing, more damages available to victims who can sue, and doubling the fine for discrimination. And where do the fines go? The fines go to pay for more testing. This next item has to do with supervision and responsibility. An associate broker who serves as an office manager supervising other associate brokers or salespeople is responsible for their discrimination. And requiring agencies to further fair housing and to combat segregation as part of their housing programs. So these changes are premised on the idea that if you want to stop speeding, you'll add enforcement, that the ticket given to someone isn't the real part of enforcement. It's that everyone else sees them getting the ticket. So there's a deterrent value. I think it's interesting. It will be interesting to see if we see these changes spread from New York to other states. Nationally, HUD's enforcement division is talking about stepping up enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, doing more testing nationwide. That seems much more likely under the new president and the new HUD secretary. We might have a return to vigorous enforcement of the fair housing laws.
Based on your investigations, what do you think are the best ways to combat racism in real estate?
Yeah, well, Amber, I guess the task isn't so much to combat racism as it is to combat unequal treatment. You know, if our roof was leaking, we talk about it in a less emotional way. Why is it leaking? What will it cost to fix it? So let's talk about fixes. The National Association of Realtors has responded vigorously to the Newsday investigation, and its efforts are interesting. It has a new program called ACT, A-C-T. Let's talk about that. A is for accountability, C for culture change, T for training. So A, accountability. First, NAR is working with state associations to point out where state licensing laws fail to support fair housing. They reviewed the licensing laws and enforcement in every state. That's entirely new. The National Association making recommendations to state associations for tougher fair housing regulation and enforcement of the law. Also, NAR has developed a voluntary program of self-testing, helping companies that want to test their agents for compliance with the fair housing laws. You might think, well, there would be no such companies. At the hearing in New York, the CEO of Realogy, which owns the brands, you know, Century 21 and Coldwell Banker and Sotheby's International and others, said, yes, we should be testing our own agents. So NAR says, we'll meet you halfway. It's working on a program now to help companies do testing, sort of a cookbook of all the considerations involved, and helping them make liaisons with fair housing groups that may carry the testing out for the companies. Now, this would be proprietary, sort of private testing, maybe to avoid more public testing happening. But if you have a license and your brokerage or your brand is testing you, that might be the most consequential change of all. So that's accountability. Under C, culture change, you know that the fair housing laws and already are a core component of the Realtor Code of Ethics. You may not know that from 1924 into the 1960s and into the 70s, the Realtor Code of Ethics prohibited selling a home in a white neighborhood to a Black person, or in the 70s, using a code word, anyone who's presumed to be detrimental to the neighborhood. Well, that's during my lifetime, at least. So cultures can be changed, and let's acknowledge that change can take a long time. There is a long tradition in America of redlining, of blockbusting, of racial covenants on deeds, of predatory subprime lending that strips home equity out of minority neighborhoods. We are not saying that the real estate agents created segregation. Many of you have read Richard Rothstein's wonderful book, The Color of Law, which lays segregation at the feet of government action, back to the New Deal days of the 1930s, especially with financing available only to white buyers when the modern suburbs were developed after World War II. So let's acknowledge that these are not just historical facts, but their effects continue today. Even this year, we've seen studies on differences in how appraisals are done, including the anecdote of the family that raised their appraisal $100,000 when they took down the pictures of the Black relatives in the family. The effects of segregation carry down from generation to generation, starting with the differences in wealth creation. Home equity is the money that the grandkids use to go to college. NAR says that changing the culture in real estate is probably the most difficult challenge. You saw that this past year, NAR made a public apology for past discrimination. It was interesting to see some of the chatter from agents saying, what are we apologizing for? Change will take a long time. So ACT, T stands for training. New York already had training. Our Newsday team went to the training classes and shared the curriculum with experts who found that the training was weak, jokey, hardly mentioned steering at all. The New York State Association of Realtors suspended its fair housing training, rewrote curriculum. NAR has quickly improved its training materials after our investigation. First, this spring, a new thing you'll see, NAR is rolling out a course specifically on implicit bias in real estate, how to recognize it, how to overcome it. It will be a 3-hour course for brokers who will be encouraged to teach the course to their agents. And many of you have seen a very interesting new training tool. This past fall, NAR rolled out Fairhaven, a sort of game or simulation where you can make choices and experience the pitfalls of fair housing. It's really well done. And it allows you to sort of see the perspective of an agent and the perspective of a client and fair housing problems that come up. In effect, it's really trying to teach the law, but also empathy. It takes about an hour to go through. The developers of Fairhaven made a suggestion, which is after you pass with flying colors, take it again, but miss all the questions because you get diverted onto you see different videos, you get different information, additional information. So I encourage you to have everyone in your office go through it. It's at fairhaven.realtor. Finally, NAR is making a film about good role models. After all, 2 of the 12 companies in our investigation passed their tests, and we wrote about their experience. NAR has a new award for fair housing champions, and the new film will be about real estate leaders who follow best practices in fair housing and prosper while doing it. I think all of this seems useful. I realize that quality control is difficult in an industry where agents are self-motivated, independent, working from home or out of your SUV, and some are part-time. Think about the reputational risk from the broker's perspective. Do you have confidence that your agents are giving the same listings to 2 similarly situated customers? Do you have any confidence that 2 different agents are giving the same listings to 2 customers? You know, often during our investigation, we were like air traffic controllers, sending the testers out and watching them come back, watching the videos. And we wondered, we're laymen, we're not real estate brokers, but if one of our goals was to stop agents from violating the Fair Housing Act, how hard would that be? What would we do differently? You all understand that a fix is not saying, well, we respond forcefully to all complaints. Rarely would anyone know they're being steered. There would be no complaints. No one knows what listings another customer gets. And, you know, it did seem clear to us that the brokers and agents in our test didn't have rigorous standards for what they do and don't do with every customer. So maybe a checklist would be helpful. Time and again, we saw customers come back, one with a fat folder and one with a skinny folder of information from the same agent. That seems like something you could fix. If one gets the school's brochure, give it to everybody. You could argue that it's a fix to diversify the real estate workforce, which is still more white than the communities that you serve. That would definitely have benefits. But it's not a cure-all. It can't be the only solution. We saw steering and discrimination by agents of all backgrounds, just as you can see police brutality by some minority officers. It seems clear that it's the system that needs to be addressed and not just the actions or motivations of individuals. It did seem to us that many agents in our test were unfamiliar with the minority neighborhoods. They'd been steering around the Black areas for so long that they didn't know anything about them. They didn't know about the beautiful new homes on the waterfront in Freeport. You know, after my banking stories in Atlanta, one bank put its lenders on a bus to tour the wonderful new upscale homes in a Black subdivision, a subdivision they'd never heard of. I remember them peering through the windows into the kitchens of the homes still under construction. Maybe a bus tour wouldn't be a bad idea again. We did notice that our large real estate brands on Long Island had more than 200 branches, 200 offices, but not a single community a single office in those 8 communities where most of the Black residents live, not one. And those large real estate brands didn't represent many sellers in those minority communities either. I have to wonder about the responsibility and actions of brokers. And you know, in the New York State investigations, it's the brokers as well as the agents who are at jeopardy of losing their licenses. Brokers, I wonder, do you check on which listings agents give to customers? Do you get a report? Do you know which boxes they check in the MLS to generate listings that are emailed to customers? Which boxes they don't check? Which neighborhoods or schools they chose for which customer, and what other areas might have matched up with the customer's actual criteria? Do you have any tools for that? Do agents have consistent ways of qualifying customers? If we have requirements, do we apply them to everyone? Do we require pre-approval from everyone or no one? Do we ask credit scores or income of everyone or none? I'll give the law professor Bob Schwem from Kentucky, one of our consultants, a quick word on this in a short video clip.
I'm a law professor at the University of Kentucky, and I've been a law professor for a long number of years. All we're asking in these tests, you've got 2 people who come in and ask for exactly the same thing. Why don't you give them the same listing? Why don't you pre-qualify them in exactly the same way? It's not that big a burden. This is a law. This should be treated like a tax law or any other law. You have to obey this law, and particularly if you're in a licensed business like real estate agents, if you can't obey the law, you ought to just get out.
Well, the professor really steps up to the plate and takes a swing there. I think the trick of it, though, is that I assume that all of you want to obey the law, want to obey the law. The hard part may be recognizing how can discrimination creep in and plugging those gaps. So to close, what does NAR say about fixes? NAR offers the following straightforward suggestions on avoiding steering. 1, provide customers with listings based on their objective criteria, home size, other attributes, not on vague terms such as nice neighborhood or good schools or safe. And second, pay attention, NAR suggests, to unconscious bias. When evaluating what a customer wants, ask yourself why you may have eliminated certain areas. Now, I'm a layman, but I have a question. Aren't those 2 suggestions contradictory? If you give someone all the listings based on their objective criteria, you won't be eliminating certain areas. Why should real estate agents be picking and choosing communities for buyers? That's where the risk comes in for the agents and the brokers. If we gave every customer access to all the listings within their price range, with the right number of bedrooms, within the distance they've specified to work or family, we wouldn't have steering. So it may be that the best way to stop illegal steering may be to stop steering customers at all. Send them all the listings. I assume that you all want to make sure that everyone who calls or emails or someday walks into your office is treated equally. What I hope you'll do is share our stories in 40-minute film with everyone in your office. It's all online at newsday.com/divided. Get some popcorn, have a movie night when we can all get back together. Post it on Facebook for friends and customers, have a discussion. And that's the key part, have a conversation. In this framework, our goal is to treat everyone equally, of course. Now, what specific steps can we take to make sure that that happens? I appreciate you inviting me to meet with you. My hope is that this has given you something to discuss with your colleagues and your customers, and that you'll put in additional questions where we can take them up now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for joining us today, and thank you for all of this information. It's interesting to see everything kind of behind the film that we've watched. Do we have any additional questions from our audience? Joel, do you see anything?
Type them in.
What if if it went away, hold on one second, I did find one. What if my minority client only wants to be in areas with his minority?
You're not responsible for your buyers' choices, and people can look for houses wherever they want. You might discourage them from. There's a difference between saying I want to be where I feel comfortable and saying I don't want to be near that kind of people. You might discourage that. You might have a moral responsibility to discourage that latter kind of talk. But let's say someone says, I'm Orthodox Jewish and I want to live near the temple so I can walk on Saturday. Well, of course, we'll show you how far from the temple do you want to be? Tell me the radius and I'll look only there, of course. People can choose wherever they want to live. And that's not a violation of the law for you to follow their restrictions. That's different from only show me homes that aren't next door to someone of a different race. That's a different kind of thing. But you often have to push back and say, a lot of this does come back, I think, to pushing back. If we were going to have the roofer do something that violated the building code, the roofer would say, I can't do it that way. And we would understand that. And you're in a regulated industry and you're controlled by laws. And it's okay to educate the customer and say, that would violate the Fair Housing Act. I can't make comments about, I'm not and besides, I'm not an expert in schools or crime. So sometimes what you're called upon to do here is to push back against actions where it's the customer introducing, as your question suggests. But if a person makes a decision to only look in certain areas, you're okay to follow that advice.
The next one is, where does reporting who we sold to stand in the changes?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. Where does the reporting who we sold to stand in the changes?
One of the changes was going to be that we had to report. So we had to have a discussion saying, I need to report to Department of State who I sold a house to. So I need to know your ethnicity and I need to know that. And that was something that was going to be on the table. And I just want to make one comment about the Orthodox Jews. I live in a very, very Orthodox neighborhood. And the problems that we are having are dealing with offers on Saturdays, actually. Do we say, look, I'm not going to be able to reach my client for 25 hours and do that? And the other agent says, well, you either get the answer or whatever. And then when do you say, listen, this is the religious view and they will not be available until an hour after sundown? I mean,
well, you want to consult with your attorney. I'm not pretending to be an attorney, but you're used to putting restrictions in listings. No offers accepted on Saturdays is something you could let the buyer's agents know about in your listing. That's one thought. On this idea of collecting demographic data, that's the one area of the New York provisions that the state association has pushed back on. This is a common discussion. For example, in banking, there's a Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which banks are required to collect your racial information, ethnic information. If they interact with you, they're required to ask you that question. And even if you don't fill it out, if they're present with you, they're required to write down what they perceive your race or ethnicity to be, because that's really what's important. The race of the customer doesn't matter. It's the race perceived by the buyer or the agent that matters. But the there's usually a pushback, and the discussion goes, well, we don't want to see race. We don't want to write it down.
Right.
But the problem is that if you don't count things, you can't monitor them.
Okay, so why the reporting would be going to the Department of State or whomever, and the realtor need not be a part of that process, I think is the thought.
Yeah, you just can't monitor for discriminatory actions unless you're collecting demographic data. So that's the premise of it. You might end up 10 years from now with a Home Mortgage Disclosure Act kind of requirement in real estate. No one's proposing that now, where it's a public record, every transaction, who came in, what listings were they shown, everything except the name. That's the way it works now in mortgages because of a legacy of discrimination. We're not to that point yet, but 10 years from now, if they go out and do these same tests again and get the same results, at that point you might be.
How widespread do you think fair housing violations occur?
If I were a broker, I would think that my risk, reputational risk, license, discipline risk is very high. I would not have much confidence that two different customers who come to the counter, so to speak, are going to get the same listings. Because as it seems to exist now, one agent has no idea what listings any other agent gives a customer. And it doesn't even seem as though the brokers have any idea what listings they're being given. And if you think about discrimination as people intentionally acting in a racial manner against others of a different race, in other words, if you define discrimination so narrowly as almost to define it out of existence, well, then it's not happening very much. But if you define it as treating people differently, it wasn't very difficult for us to see it. And, we weren't even throwing a flag on the close calls. It had to be extreme for us to count it as a failed test with our experts. I'll give you an example of something we didn't count. We very often saw a greater affinity between the agents and buyers if the buyers were white. For example, agents were much more likely to tell the buyer where the agent lived if the buyer was white. Much more likely to say, I raised my kids in this community. We went to this schools. We really like it here. White buyers were often told that. Minority buyers often heard nothing from the agent about at all where the agent lived. Now, that suggests to me, we had one agent who was offering babysitting to the white buyer. If you bought in our neighborhood, I know of a friend who will babysit your kids. But that same agent didn't tell the minority buyer even where the agent lived, even though the agent was showing homes in that community. Now, that suggests that there's some unconscious bias, some affinity that can certainly creep in. So I don't think the training on unconscious bias or the Fairhaven kind of simulation is at all out of line. And that's probably a bigger part of the problem than sort of raw prejudice. So I'm guessing that it's pretty widespread. We didn't have any trouble finding it.
Bill, I know that this is kind of a refresher question, but what information can we give regarding schools if we are asked?
Well, so I'm not your lawyer, but the law professor and the experts seem to say that the very key thing is to make sure you would give the same information to everyone. They also urge that you just keep in mind that you're not experts in schools, that knowing which schools will best fit this customer is something you can't know. People want different things in schools. Some people want the lacrosse team and others want the band program. And the best approach seems to be to find sources of objective information, which includes work done by the customer, and to urge that on every customer. Here's a few places where we have some information about every school district. Our local newspaper runs school test scores, though those mostly reflect who goes to the school and not how well the teaching is done in the school. But here's some objective information, and we're going to give it to everybody. It's in everybody's new client folder. That's really what they urge. Is it's not like there's a limitation on what you can say on schools, other than don't drag race and religion. Don't say there are two schools in this district. One's more Asian and the other one's more Jewish. Don't get into that. That's for where you shouldn't be. But beyond that, the key thing is give the same information to everyone. Don't be encouraging, discouraging. Don't be making lists of schools to go to and schools to avoid. Even though your customers are new to town and come in saying, what school district should I look at? Which one should I not? They're pushing you to violate the law, and you may have to say to them, I'm not the one to give you that advice.
Maybe refer them to the schools. Have them contact the schools to get the information from the schools.
And of course, post-pandemic, they can do what many of us have done, which is visit schools and talk to the principal or whoever gives the tours. There will be tours again someday.
But Bill, I do have one more question here. Do the agents steer buyers away from sellers who are minorities, or rate minority-owned seller homes at a comparatively lower price?
It's possible. I think one of the things that's really challenging about this is the way a lot of this is sort of circular. Agents have been steering around Freeport on Long Island for generations, or Uniondale. So there hasn't been as much appreciation of homes in those communities. Those are the minority communities. There's less money for the schools in those communities, so people feel justified in saying the schools aren't so good. So they steer around those communities, which harms them further. You see how sort of circular it is? People feel justified in making these kinds of recommendations, or appraisers if it won't appraise at a certain level, as you know, then you can't get the loan and you can't sell it at that level. So that's what NAR is talking about with a culture where all of this sort of seems justified in the moment. I'm just trying to help my customer, but it's both the cause and the effect of the problem. And therefore it perpetuates from generation to generation. That's the insidious part of this.
It looks like that was actually our last question. And I really appreciate your time today. I appreciate everybody for attending today. And Bill, any last minutes, comments or advice for us?
No, I just thank all of you. One thing that shocked me this year was to hear that the Washington State Association of Realtors said, in Washington State, they said, we're going to start testing our agents in Washington State. That just blew my mind. You never know where something will have an impact. I think we're going to see changes like that over the next decade that continue actions by regulators, by local associations, and by state associations, as well as NAR and the big brokerage companies. I think there's a lot more that will happen on this front. Thank you. Thank you all. You're very kind. Thank you very much.